5 remarkable events after Jesus' death. Number 1. The centurion's declaration of faith. When Jesus died, it wasn't just an end, but the beginning of something transformative for humanity. One of the most impactful reactions to Jesus' death came from a Roman centurion, who, upon witnessing these events, truly declared, "This was the Son of God." Matthew 27, verse 54. Who was this centurion? In Roman times, a centurion was a military officer similar to a captain, responsible for around 100 soldiers. Imagine an experienced and hard-end soldier, someone who has seen it all when it comes to life and death. This particular centurion was present at Jesus' crucifixion, which, by the way, was a brutal form of Roman execution, reserved for slaves, criminals, and rebels. Designed to be slow, painful, and public, it was a stern warning to anyone who dared to challenge Roman authority. The Bible, particularly in Mark's Gospel, chapter 15, gives us a vivid picture of that day. Jesus was arrested, tried, and condemned to death by being nailed to a cross, a common method at that time for executing criminals. The place was Golgotha, which means place of the skull, Mark 15, verse 22. Imagine the grim scene, 3 crosses against the sky, soldiers and a crowd of onlookers. Jesus was in the middle with 2 criminals on either side. As Jesus hung there, the sky darkened for 3 hours, an eerie and disturbing phenomenon, Mark 15, verse 33. This is where the centurion came in, probably to ensure that the execution went according to plan. He had probably overseen many crucifixions. It was part of his job. But this one was different. When Jesus finally died, he exclaimed, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Mark 15, verse 34. It wasn't just a cry of agony, but a profound expression of feeling abandoned in the darkest hour. The centurion, observing all this, witnessed something remarkable. Mark 15, verse 39 tells us, "And when the centurion who stood by Jesus saw that he was thus crying out, he said, 'Truly, this man is the Son of God.'" You can imagine what was going through his mind. A Roman soldier, accustomed to death, saw something that made him question everything he had believed before. As if at that moment the centurion saw beyond the ordinary, recognizing something divine and extraordinary in Jesus' death. This is significant for several reasons. Firstly, it is a powerful testimony coming from an unexpected source. The centurion was not a follower of Jesus. He was part of the machine that carried him out. However, he couldn't help but recognize the truth before his eyes. Secondly, this moment reflects a turning point, a crack in the Roman perception of power and authority. The centurion's statement is like a light shining through the darkness of that day, a recognition of Jesus' true identity, despite the apparent defeat of the crucifixion. Ultimately, it is a story of realization and revelation. The centurion, with his simple yet profound statement, becomes a symbol of the universal impact of Jesus' life and death. He represents the idea that anyone, regardless of their background or beliefs, can recognize the truth of who Jesus is. This statement by a Roman soldier, probably a pagan, is significant. It symbolizes the universal impact of Jesus' death, reaching beyond the Jewish community to the wider world, reminding us that Jesus' message and salvation are for everyone, regardless of circumstance. It is comforting to know that Jesus' sacrifice is inclusive, penetrating the darkness that has enveloped the world. Picture the scene. Jesus, the Son of God, had just been crucified, a cruel and painful death reserved for criminals. His followers and loved ones from afar, their hearts heavy with sadness and confusion, watched the sky as if in mourning. Next to them, it grew dark. It was a moment of profound sadness, but also the turning point in a story that would change the world forever. This darkness that fell during Jesus' crucifixion is truly riveting, isn't it? In the Bible, darkness often has a deeper meaning than just the absence of light. As for Jesus' death, this darkness can be seen as representing several significant things. Firstly, in the Bible, darkness is often associated with judgment and God's displeasure. Think of how in the Old Testament darkness was one of the plagues sent to Egypt, Exodus 10, verses 21 to 23. It's like a sign that something serious and unique is happening, something that is not an ordinary event. So when darkness fell while Jesus was being crucified, it's like a sign that this moment was a significant act of judgment. It was about the 6th hour, and there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour, while the sun was being darkened. Luke 23 verses 44 and 45. Another way of interpreting this is as the importance of Jesus' sacrifice. This wasn't just any moment. It was the occasion when the Son of God was taking on the sin of the world. The darkness can be seen as reflecting the weight of sin and the sadness of that moment. Furthermore, this darkness represents the mourning and grief of creation itself. It is as if the natural world was responding to the injustice and sadness of Jesus' death. The Creator was being crucified, and creation itself was reacting. The darkness at Jesus' crucifixion was about the judgment of the gravity of sin and the mourning of creation. It wasn't just a dramatic backdrop. It was a unique message about what was happening at that moment, linked to God's punishment of Pharaoh. The Old Testament is full of stories and predictions that resemble the events of the New Testament. This connection makes the stories interesting. A good example is the use of darkness as a sign, which appears both in the Old Testament and during the crucifixion of Jesus in the New Testament. In the Old Testament, a similar darkness is mentioned during one of the most dramatic passages. The plagues of Egypt, specifically the 9th plague, as recounted in Exodus 10 verses 21 to 29. Here, God instructs Moses to stretch out his hand toward the sky, causing a darkness so dense over Egypt for 3 days that it seemed tangible. The darkness served as a divine judgment against Pharaoh in Egypt, a demonstration of God's power and a sign of deliverance for the Israelites. Moving on to the New Testament, at the time of Jesus' crucifixion, from the 6th hour until the 9th hour, there was darkness over the whole earth. This was no ordinary darkness. It was as if the whole world went dark in the middle of the day. This unusual event occurred when Christ died. Think of it this way. Before good things happened, there was darkness, like in Egypt before the Israelites were freed from slavery, and before Jesus sacrificed himself to save people from their sins, there was darkness at Calvary. It's intriguing how darkness, which is usually associated with something negative, can actually foreshadow something hopeful and good. Furthermore, consider the temporal synchronicity between two remarkable stories. The darkness in Egypt for 3 days, and Jesus' stay in the tomb for the same period. Both represent the first sign of a promise of redemption and hope, illustrating the continuity and fulfillment of prophecy over time. These narratives are not isolated events, but signs of a larger story that would later unfold with Jesus. In both accounts, the darkness is not the end. In Egypt, it dissipated, leading to the Exodus, and on Calvary, it gave way to the resurrection. It's almost as if the Bible is telling us that in our darkest moments, hope is just around the corner. So what can we draw from this? Perhaps it's a reminder that God's plans are often hidden in the shadows, waiting to emerge into the light. Or maybe it's the assurance that even in the darkest times, there is a purpose and a promise of deliverance and new life. What do you think? Can the difficult times you've been through in life lead to great positive changes? There's a connection with the feast of Easter. The darkness at Jesus' crucifixion is deeply intertwined with the Passover feast. Now, why this connection with Easter? To understand this, we need to go back to the history of the Israelites. Passover is a very important festival in the Jewish religion, celebrating the moment when the Israelites were freed from slavery in Egypt. The central event of Passover is the Passover lamb, a sacrifice made as a sign of God's promise to spare the Israelites from the 10th plague that struck Egypt, the death of the firstborn. Here, the connection becomes clear. Jesus' action, which took place during Passover, is no coincidence. In the Bible, Jesus is often referred to as the Lamb of God. John the Baptist introduced Jesus with these words, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." John 1:29. Jesus' death is compared to the way the Passover lamb was sacrificed in the past. Just as the blood of the Passover lamb spared the Israelites, the shedding of Christ's blood is seen as freeing humanity from sin. But why the darkness? In the Bible, darkness often represents God's displeasure and judgment on sin. It symbolizes sadness and despair in a world without Jesus. This means that Jesus brings light and hope to the world again. He addressed the crowd saying, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." John 8:12. Therefore, Jesus' death temporarily plunges the world into darkness, both literally and spiritually. However, the story doesn't end in darkness. Just as the Passover led to the liberation of the Israelites, Jesus' resurrection brings hope and light back to the world. It's a beautiful narrative of redemption and renewal. Isn't it interesting how Passover and the crucifixion, although hundreds of years apart, are so closely related? The blood of the Passover lamb brought physical liberation to the Israelites, while Jesus' sacrifice is seen as bringing spiritual liberation to all of humanity. The darkness at the crucifixion symbolizes the gravity of that moment, a world lost in sin, but it also sets the stage for the triumphant return of light in Jesus' resurrection. Therefore, the darkness at the crucifixion is a unique sign that refers to Easter. It signals judgment, the seriousness of Jesus' sacrifice, and the temporary absence of light from the world. But just as the Passover story didn't end with the plagues, our belief in Jesus doesn't end with the crucifixion. The resurrection brings light and hope, just like the liberation of the Israelites in Egypt. Jesus, after being betrayed, tried, and condemned, was crucified from noon to 3 p.m., when darkness came over the whole land, as reported in Mark 15:33 and Luke 23:44-45. This was not a typical event. It was midday, a time when the sun is at its highest. So why the sudden darkness? The timing is also crucial. According to Corinthians 5:21, God made him who had no sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. It's really touching. When Jesus was bearing the sins of the world, everything went dark. When he was crucified, it was as if the light was momentarily extinguished, leaving the world in darkness. Doesn't that make you think about the spiritual implications? Was this a physical manifestation of the spiritual darkness that sin brings? Furthermore, this event fulfilled the Old Testament prophecy. "In that day, declares the sovereign Lord, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight." Amos 8:9. This darkness could be the fulfillment of this prophecy, indicating that Jesus' crucifixion was part of God's divine plan for salvation. The darkness is significant because of what followed. It lasted 3 hours, and then Jesus cried out and gave up his spirit. The darkness was temporary, as was the separation between God and humanity that Jesus came to overcome. His resurrection, which took place soon after, brought light back into the world, both literally and figuratively. Isn't it amazing to think that the worst moments in history were just the beginning of the best? The dark sky when Jesus was crucified shows how God feels about mistakes and what the world is like without Jesus, when God and people have been separated for a brief period. The impacts of Jesus' death on nature are quite mysterious. It's as if nature itself is reacting to this monumental event. For example, remember how the Bible talks about darkness covering the earth. It's intriguing to think that the middle of the day became as dark as night, as if the sun itself was in mourning. And then imagine the ground shaking and the rocks breaking at the very moment of Jesus' death. It's as if the earth was responding to something extraordinary. These events are nature's way of recognizing the importance of Jesus' death. It's not every day that you hear about the natural world reacting in such a dramatic way. These events signified the transition from the old covenant to the new, and the message that, through Jesus' sacrifice, everyone now had direct access to God. This moment, with its accompanying natural phenomena, emphasizes the significance of Jesus' death. It's not just a historical event. It's a turning point that reshaped religious thinking and understanding. These extraordinary occurrences highlight the importance of what was happening. Jesus' death was not just the execution of a man, but a moment that changed the course of history and spiritual belief. Now let's examine the exact events that took place when Jesus died. Number 3, the veil of the temple was torn. What happened when Jesus died? The Bible tells us about an extraordinary event, the tearing of the veil in the temple. This moment is rich in meaning. First of all, imagine the temple in Jerusalem, the heart of Jewish worship. Inside, there was a special curtain, or veil, separating the Holy of Holies, where God's presence was believed to reside, from the rest of the temple. This veil was not just a thin cloth, but a thick and elaborate material, symbolizing the separation between God and humanity due to sin. Now imagine the moment of Jesus' death on the cross. This was no small event. The veil tearing from top to bottom, not from bottom to top, as if done by human hands, signified divine intervention. But what does this dramatic act mean in connection with the Old Testament? The tearing of the temple veil at the exact moment of Jesus' death is deeply rooted in Old Testament traditions. To understand its full significance, let's dive into the narrative and connect the dots. In the Old Testament, the temple in Jerusalem was the focal point of Jewish religious life. The holiest part of the temple was the Holy of Holies, separated by a veil. This veil was no ordinary curtain. It was a thick, ornate fabric that served as a physical and symbolic barrier between God and humanity. Only the high priest could enter this sacred space, and that only once a year on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people. Leviticus 16:2-34. Jesus' death broke down this barrier of sin. His sacrifice, unlike the repetitive animal sacrifices, was enough once and for all to atone for everyone's mistakes. The act of tearing the veil was as if God were saying, "This way to me is now open." Furthermore, the tearing of the veil represents God's accessibility to all people. Before, only the high priest had this annual access to God's presence. But now, through Jesus, everyone has direct access to God. What does the torn veil mean? Why did the earth shake, and why was the curtain of the temple torn in two? To understand this, we need to look at the context of this event. The curtain of the temple, an immense veil, separated the Holy of Holies, the most sacred part of the temple, where God was believed to reside, from the rest of the temple. Only the high priest could enter this space, just once a year, to offer sacrifices for the sins of the people. Gospel of Matthew 27-50-51. We find a precise description of these events. Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and gave up the spirit. Behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, and the rocks were split. This suggests that Jesus' death was the perfect sacrifice for the atonement of humanity's sins. The book of Hebrews makes this connection explicitly. The fact that the veil was torn from top to bottom suggests a divine action, not a human one, as if God himself were breaking down the barrier. This symbolizes the end of the Old Covenant and the dawn of the New. The rituals and sacrifices of the Old Testament would no longer be necessary. Jesus' sacrifice changed everything. The tearing of the veil also signals a new era of grace. In the Old Testament, the law was central, and adherence to the law was the way to maintain a relationship with God. But now, with the veil torn, it's about grace through faith in Jesus. By grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves. It is the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. Ephesians 2:8-9. In simple terms, Jesus' death not only transformed the way we approach God, but also inaugurated a relationship based on grace, not rituals. The tearing of the veil is as if God were opening a door that had been closed since the fall of Adam and Eve. God removes the barrier, inviting us into a personal and intimate relationship with Him. What does this mean for us today? Jesus' sacrifice created a direct way for people to connect with God on their own, without the need for someone to mediate this relationship. Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have the confidence to enter the Holy of Holies through the blood of Jesus, through a new and living way that He opened for us through the veil, that is, through His body. Hebrews 10:19-20. It means that the barrier of sin that separated us from God has been removed. Through Jesus, we can have a personal relationship with God. We no longer need a human mediator like the high priest of old, for there is one God and one mediator between God and men, the man Christ Jesus. 1 Timothy 2:5. The tearing of the veil was like God opening a previously locked door and inviting us in. It's a powerful image of invitation, reconciliation, and new beginnings. Gone are the old forms of separation and limited access, replaced by an open invitation to a personal and direct relationship with God. This invites us to reflect. Do we live in the freedom and access that Jesus' sacrifice provided, or do we live as if the veil is still there, separating us from God? It's a question worth pondering. Furthermore, the resurrection of the dead, the earthquakes and the rocks breaking were not just normal events in nature, they were indications of a huge event in the spiritual world. The tombs opened and the bodies of many holy people who had died were resurrected. They came out of the tombs after Jesus' resurrection and appeared to many in the holy city. Matthew 27:52-53. This is a fascinating and somewhat mysterious part of what happened on the day of Jesus' death, meaning that Jesus' death was not just a tragedy but a victory over death itself. Who were these people? They were people who had died, some of them probably a long time ago, but who had suddenly come back to life. It's like a scene where all hope seems lost and then, suddenly, a miraculous turnaround happens. Now, who exactly were these people? There are no names or stories of these people. They are simply described as holy people, which probably refers to faithful believers, perhaps prophets or righteous people from the past. But why did this happen? Here it gets really interesting. This event was like a provocation, a preview of what was about to happen. Jesus himself would be resurrected 3 days later. It's as if these resurrected people were setting the stage for the main event, Jesus' own resurrection. Think of it as a powerful sign that death is not the end of the story, not for Jesus, and not for those who believe in him. As for the connection with the Old Testament, the resurrection of the dead at the moment of Jesus' death is connected to the Old Testament. The Old Testament is full of clues and predictions about events that would be described in the New Testament, such as the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Let's look at the big picture. The Old Testament is full of prophecies and signs that point to Jesus. They are like a long story with clues scattered along the way. When the resurrection of the dead occurred at the time of Jesus' death, it can be seen as one of those moments of great revelation. Regarding the resurrection of the dead, the Bible doesn't present a direct Old Testament prophecy about this specific event, but it does talk a lot about resurrection in general. For example, in the book of Daniel, there is a very interesting verse in Daniel 12:2 which says, "Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." This verse is like a preview of the idea that there will be a resurrection, an awakening from death. Another example is in Isaiah 26:19, which says, "Your dead will live, their bodies will rise again. Awake and sing for joy, you who dwell in the dust." Again, it's as if the Old Testament is hinting that the dead will rise. These verses set the scene for what happened when Jesus died. It's as if the Old Testament is saying, watch out, because the resurrection is going to be a big deal. So in the New Testament, when Jesus dies and these people are resurrected, it's like a confirmation, a powerful sign that what was promised or hinted at in the Old Testament is coming true. The resurrection of the dead and the death of Jesus also emphasize an important theme in the Bible, God's power over life and death. The Old Testament often speaks of God as the giver of life and the one who has dominion over death. For example, in Deuteronomy 32:39, God says, "See now that I, even I, am He, and there is no God besides me. I kill and I make alive. I wound and I heal, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand." So when these people rise from the dead in the New Testament, it is as a dramatic demonstration of this power. Jesus is called the first fruits of the dead. Imagine that we are putting together a jigsaw puzzle of a story that spreads over two parts, the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the New Testament, especially in 1 Corinthians 15:20, it says, "But Christ was raised from the dead, being the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep." This term first fruits is an agricultural analogy, referring to the first portion of a harvest that was often offered to God as a sign of gratitude and hope for more to come. When Jesus is described as the first fruits of the dead, it implies that he is the first example of what is to come in terms of resurrection. He is proof that the afterlife is real and not just a one-off event. It's as if when you see the first flower bloom in spring, you know that the rest of the flowers are on their way. So when Jesus is described as the first fruits of the dead, it's like saying that he is the first and best example of what is to come for all who believe in him. Just as the first fruits were a promise of more harvest to come, Jesus' resurrection is seen as a promise of a future resurrection for believers. This connection is quite interesting because it shows the continuity between the Old and New Testaments. It's not something random. There's a deep and meaningful link. The concept of first fruits in the Old Testament sets the stage for understanding Jesus' resurrection in the New Testament. It's like a thread that ties the whole story of the Bible together, showing that by speaking of Jesus as the first fruits of the dead, we are saying that he is the first example of this incredible promise of life after death, a promise that has been hinted at and built upon since Old Testament times. It's a way of understanding that what happened to Jesus wasn't just an isolated event. It's part of a much bigger plan, a divine plan. Number 5, the empty tomb. What happened? Have you ever wondered about the story behind Jesus' empty tomb? It's like a real-life mystery, full of suspense and surprises. Imagine this. Jesus, the man who performed miracles and spoke of love and forgiveness, has just been crucified. His followers are devastated, confused, and afraid. What do they do now? It all starts with a man called Joseph of Arimathea. The Bible describes him as a wealthy man and a member of the Jewish council, but curiously, he was also a secret follower of Jesus. Joseph goes to Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and asks for Jesus' body, Matthew 27-57-58. Imagine the courage he showed in making this decision. Basically, he was revealing his loyalty to Jesus, which was extremely risky at the time. Pilate agrees, and Joseph obtains the body, accompanied by Nicodemus, another secret follower, who brings about 34 kilograms of spices for the burial, thus showing great respect for Jesus. John 19:39. They wrap Jesus' body in a clean sheet with the spices, according to Jewish burial customs, and place him in a new tomb dug in the rock by Joseph, where no one had ever been placed before, thus fulfilling the prophecy of Isaiah 53:9 about Jesus being buried with the rich. But little did they know that this was only the beginning of something extraordinary. The next day, the chief priests and Pharisees, worried that Jesus' followers might steal his body and claim that he had risen from the dead, go to Pilate and get permission to secure the tomb and put up a guard. Matthew 27:62-66. They sealed the tomb and put guards there, trying to ensure that Jesus' story would end there. However, on the first day of the week at dawn, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary go to the tomb. Imagine their shock to find an angel sitting on the stone with the guards passed out. The angel reassures them that Jesus has risen, and the women run to tell the disciples. At that moment, Jesus himself meets them on the road, greets them, and instructs them to inform the disciples that he will see them in Galilee. Matthew 28:1-10. Meanwhile, some of the guards enter the city and tell the chief priests everything that has happened. Panicked, the priests bribe the guards to lie, saying that Jesus' disciples came during the night and stole his body while they were sleeping. Matthew 28:11-15. No matter how hard they try to hide the truth, it always comes out. Jesus' empty tomb is not just a mystery to be unraveled. It is a testimony to the power of the resurrection and the promise of eternal life for all who believe in him. It's not just a story about a missing body. It's a narrative about promises fulfilled, the power of faith in a miracle that changed the course of history. The empty tomb symbolizes hope, renewal, and the triumph of life over death. This story invites us to reflect on what we believe and how we view Jesus, who claimed to be the Son of God and proved it in a dramatic way. More than an end, Jesus' empty tomb represents a beginning, the start of a new understanding of life, death, and what lies beyond. It challenges our conceptions of what is possible and urges us to look beyond the tangible. The story of the empty tomb is not just an ancient legend. It is a historical event that defies simplistic explanations. It is a story of faith and a divine revelation that has continued to fascinate people for centuries, generating wonder, debate, and strengthening faith. It invites us to explore our own beliefs and consider the possibility of a love and power that transcends death. As far as the Old Testament is concerned, Jesus' empty tomb is linked to prophecies and themes that point directly to his life, death, and resurrection. The system of sacrifices, such as the Passover lamb in Exodus 12, is seen as a foreshadowing of Jesus' final sacrifice, which brings salvation not only to Israel, but to all of humanity. Messianic prophecies, such as Isaiah 53, are rich in descriptions that point to Jesus as the suffering servant who bears the sins of many. Furthermore, Jesus himself makes connections between his death and resurrection with the story of Jonah, Matthew 12:40. These connections between the Old Testament and Jesus' empty tomb highlight the continuity and fulfillment of divine promises throughout history. The connection between the Old Testament and the New Testament is striking, where events and symbols from the past are echoed in the narratives about Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. Although the Old Testament does not explicitly address the resurrection as we understand it in the New Testament, there are hints and foreshadowings that point to this monumental event. For example, Ezekiel's vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, symbolizing the revitalization of Israel, hints at the resurrection that culminates in Jesus' empty tomb. Understanding the significance of the empty tomb involves recognizing these deep connections between the Old and New Testaments, showing how the story of Jesus not only fulfills the prophecies of the Old Testament, but also brings a new hope and promise of resurrection for all who believe in him. The Old Testament establishes themes of sacrifice, redemption, and resurrection, all of which find their climax in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The events that followed immediately after Jesus' death are not mere historical facts, but invitations to reflect on our own relationship with God and the significance of his redemptive work. The torn veil, the earthquakes, the resurrection of the saints, and the empty tomb are powerful symbols of this new spiritual reality. They invite us to abandon our old ways, to approach God without fear, and to live with an eternal perspective. Each of Jesus' post-mortem events carries with it timeless truths and promises that are still relevant today. They challenge us to reflect, respond, and reorient our lives in the light of the incredible story of Jesus' death and resurrection. As we contemplate these mysteries and miraculous events, we are invited to a deeper appreciation of God's redeeming love manifested in the story of Jesus.